I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a global podcast. We do weekly deep dive interviews with national and international experts, authors, journalists, artists, business leaders, entertainers, and opinion shapers, and we include your questions and comments. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to join us. We invite those of you who have not yet joined our podcast to become members as we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics and issues, distinguished by consistent high-level content and technical excellence. And to become a member of this podcast, simply go to graymatter.show. That's gray with an E. In this episode, we talked to political analyst Marc Sandalow, who headed the Washington bureau of the San Francisco Chronicle for 10 of the 21 years he was on the paper's staff, now serves as the associate director of the Washington Center. He's a graduate of Oberlin. He's also the author of Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi's Life, Times, and Rise to Power, and Ballparks, A Panoramic History, and certainly well-known throughout the Bay Area and beyond for his excellent political commentary and writings. And he's also a teacher. And we invite and welcome again your questions and comments, and I welcome Marc Sandalow. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you, Michael. Always good to be with somebody who's been doing this as long, if not longer, than I have.
Well, we call it gray matter because of the fact that things are sometimes really ambiguous. That's a good segue to talk about the trials of Donald Trump, the first one and maybe the only one before the election. But like you're prognosticating maybe, or I don't know, you don't have a crystal ball, but where is all this leading? What's the trajectory of all this as you see it at this point?
It's a good question. And as usual, I always start by pointing out that, people asked pundits like myself this in 2016. And, we assured you there is no chance whatsoever that somebody like Donald Trump can win the Republican nomination, let alone the presidency. So you have to take that all with a grain of salt. I mean, I know you've written some books. If you were to propose a novel to me and it had this in there, I would have told you it's insane. Michael, there's no chance somebody who's on trial for the things he's on trial for would ever be in the stage of running for president. So, but here we are. And, there's so many trials to go through. I can't believe that daily discussion is going on now in New York about paying off a porn star, about he was not doing it to hide it from his family, about the different affairs that he had. It's hard to imagine that at least at the margins, whether he's guilty or not, that doesn't hurt him in the eyes of some voters. But we've been saying that for years now about Trump.
Well, it's also almost axiomatic that, unless he shoots someone on Fifth Avenue or whatever that little cliche was, maybe his base will not go. But there are people who are somewhat in the gray zone in terms of not being decided about who they want to vote for. A lot of people are dissatisfied with both candidates, to be sure. So I'm thinking, and again, maybe you could disabuse me of this, all these Americans who are maybe somewhat on the fence or not entirely decided what they want to do in the campaign up ahead, they see someone convicted by a jury, and they don't necessarily say, oh, well, it was in Manhattan, therefore it doesn't necessarily have any credence with me. Because they see all these TV shows, Law and Order, going back to Perry Mason and so forth. They believe in the jury system. They believe that it has a certain sanctity to it. Maybe that's my illusion.
Well, first of all, I think I don't know a soul, and I know I live in a bubble. I don't know a soul who's undecided. It's not, even the people I know who aren't going to vote, who are going to vote for Trump, it's not like they're saying, I think I'm going to vote for him, but I'm torn. The big issue here, and it's really your same point, though, is who's going to show up to vote. And there are certainly people who can't stand Joe Biden, but if enough bad things come out about Trump, maybe can't stomach going to the polls for him. I understand what you're saying about the justice system. Donald Trump has been very, very effective at taking away America's confidence in the news media and the judicial system. I mean, he has talked about, day after day, despite the gag order, he talks about how this is an unfair trial. And, if you're not a Trump person, of course, these arguments sound ridiculous. But if you're a Trump person and day after day you're told the judge is biased, the juries are biased, they're fake liberals or they're fakers in there who are liberals who are trying to sabotage him. Joe Biden orchestrated this trial in New York City to keep him off the campaign trail. There are a lot of people who believe that.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are indeed a lot of people that believe it. It's amazing, though, that Mike Johnson, who talked about all the election being stolen and everything, I don't want to move away from the campaign here, but I'm still sort of stupefied by the fact that he came out and worked out this deal and got all the right wing and the Freedom Caucus angry at him. But we can take that up in a moment. Actually, maybe we should stay with the campaign for now. But that's, again, one of those things that you would have never expected. That's why it comes to my mind. Never predicted.
2 out of 3 Republicans at this point say that Joe Biden was not rightfully elected. But I always wonder this. If you could, I'm sure there's a better way to put it. This is going to sound violent. Put a gun to somebody's head and said, all right, there is a right or a wrong answer. You get it wrong, you don't live. You get it right, you live. Was this a fair election? I don't know, Donald Trump, he may deep down in his deep core believe he was robbed. I have a hard time believing that 2 out of 3 Americans, let alone all the Republicans like Mike Johnson who say the election was stolen, believe it. I don't think behind the scenes they believe that for a moment.
Well, it's hard sometimes to believe that 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, but we've got a rematch here between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and a lot of those people who voted for Trump are presumably still going to be behind him and don't see Biden as someone who can lead us.
I also think, the analogy I always think of is like a bull in a china shop. That's usually a bad thing because you want to protect the china. And Trump is a bull who's going to destroy everything. But if the china shop is evil, if the china shop is Washington and you think all of Washington is corrupt, you're perfectly happy to have it tear it down. Before he was elected in 2016, something like 65%, almost 2/3 of Americans said that he does not have the character to be president. More than half said he was not trustworthy enough to be president. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won the election despite that. And it's because I think that there are a lot of Americans who think that the system is so corrupt. And this is where the left has to pay attention, because it's not just fools falling for Donald Trump. It's a huge number of Americans who hate the status quo.
And we're talking also about young people and how they are shifting. I mean, with what's going on in terms of the sympathy for Palestinians and even sympathy for Hamas, who are terrorists, there is a real shift in terms of the generation. Young people and people of color identify perhaps more with Palestinians than a previous generation did, and that's going to hurt Biden because Biden is seen as a Zionist.
There's no, I teach University of California students and talk to them constantly about this. And, very few of them are going to vote for Donald Trump. An awful lot of them are not going to vote. And look, I remember this when I was a student at Oberlin College. To date myself, it was a choice between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And with my Oberlin idealism, I voted for Barry Commoner, because I certainly wasn't going to vote for either of those 2 establishment figures. I understand where they're coming from, but they are basically, the problem is, and in California, it won't make any difference, but if the students at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, or Wisconsin and Madison, if they don't vote, then he's going to lose Michigan and Wisconsin, and Donald Trump is going to be the next president.
He may lose Michigan just because of the Arab vote in Michigan and people not showing up to vote. I mean, those are big numbers. They could swing
and it's not a very good argument to say, yeah, their policies are kind of similar, but look, Donald Trump throws hatred of Arabs and Muslims on top of the same policy as Biden. You can't put that on a bumper sticker, but it's the case. And there are a lot of students who are angry about the fact they're not getting the student loan relief, even though they're getting plenty of it, but that Biden had hoped to get because Congress won't pass it. They're mad at him for approving the Willow pipeline in Alaska, which they see makes him unpure on global warming. And, youth are, and the fact that this guy is, I always point out to them, there are more days have passed between Joe Biden's day of birth and today than the day he was born and the end of the Civil War. This is a guy who's not like old enough to be their father or grandfather. He's old enough to be their great-grandfather, and they have a hard time relating to him.
Well, they see him as being somewhat cognitively impaired. A lot of Americans do. I'm not sure why they don't see Trump that way, because, he also says things that qualify as serious malaprops or tongue-tied or however you want to characterize. But the fact of the matter is that Biden seems to get more of the geriatric kind of stuff from young people and from Americans in general.
I think that it's objectively fair to say that Biden comes across as an older person. I mean, Trump certainly seems to have more oomph in his step. What you just said, absolutely true. I mean, Trump doesn't show any more signs of cognitive ability. That's for certain.
Well, let's look at this also from the standpoint of what could happen. You mentioned Barry Commoner. I remember John Anderson, Ross Perot. I mean, there are other candidates that loom in this election as well. And one of them is Robert Kennedy Jr., who certainly a lot of young people seem to be drawn to, especially young people who have their doubts about vaccinations and the like, or certainly about what we need for to stave off COVID. I mean, what kind of a factor do you think is this going to play out? Some people think it's going to hurt Biden. Other people think it's going to hurt Trump.
Yeah, I think the latest polls suggest it's going to hurt Trump more than Biden, and that they run polls that say who will you vote for, and Trump comes up ahead, and then they throw Robert Kennedy into that mix, and suddenly Biden does better than Trump. So there people think, especially because of that anti-vax bit you're talking about, that's more of a MAGA, that's more of a Trump crowd. That comes from people who don't necessarily believe the news they read or the science that's out there. So that's more of a Trump crowd.
And when you think about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., though, you think about some really good environmental work and some positive things in the Kennedy name, but some wacky stuff, too. I mean, young people are drawn to him, though, perhaps because he's just not Joe Biden or not Donald Trump.
So I ask my students at the beginning of every term a series of questions anonymously, and one of them is, who would you be most excited to vote for in politics for president? And, Biden gets 1 or 2 votes out of 60, every term. Actually, Robert Kennedy, none. I've been stunned at how many votes, not a lot, 2, 3, 4, for Marianne Williamson. It's like, okay, she's not Barry Commoner, but she's another vote for none of the above. But I'll tell you who always comes out on top. They don't like old people unless they're Bernie Sanders. AOC and Bernie Sanders always come out 1 and 2 in the University of California student polls that I do.
What about Cornel West or Jill Stein?
It doesn't come up, does not come up. And Gavin Newsom gets more votes than the vice president, Kamala Harris, which has got to be bothersome to her. If the Biden White House could hear the conversations in my classroom, they would be horrified. They'd be terrified, because these students, they're at least that's what they say. They're not planning on voting for Joe Biden.
Notwithstanding your students, I think, is it fair to say Kamala Harris is a liability to Joe Biden?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that. Then the question is why? And we don't know the answer. Is it because she has underperformed? Is it because the White House hasn't given her responsibility? Is it because she's a woman and Americans still aren't ready for a woman, or an African-American Asian woman? We don't know why that is. I mean, was Mike Pence, they talk about Kamala Harris, oh, she's only on the ticket because she's a woman and she's a woman of color. That's the Democratic base. If it weren't for women and women of color, the Democrats wouldn't be in office. Mike Pence was on the ticket because he was a fundamental Christian, and that's absolutely necessary for the Republican base. So it's a little hard to know whether or not this is her fault or not.
So let's get back to the trial, though. I mean, the one that's going on now under Alvin Bragg's supervision. The fact of the matter is that they have to pretty much prove intent in this, don't they? They have to prove, in other words, that Trump had a motivation that was political.
Absolutely. If he was doing this, like this came up with Bill Clinton too, to the extent that, Bill Clinton lied because he didn't want Hillary to know about his affairs. And in this case, if it was because he didn't want Melania to know that while she was in the hospital delivering birth to their child, he was off with a porn star, then that's a private matter, because this, and it gets complicated here, but Alvin Bragg, he can certainly prove that he filed false business records. That's a misdemeanor. It's a felony if he can prove that he did it in order to hide another crime. And that's the crime you're talking about, which is it was election fraud, not simply trying to hide something personally. And that's why he's had this guy, David Pecker, the publisher of the editor of the National Enquirer for the last couple of days, who has testified in every conversation he had with Trump. He always wanted him to kill these stories for political reasons. He never once said, oh my God, imagine if my wife saw this.
Well, one of the good things that's coming out of this trial is just how much the National Enquirer went along with stories, including some pretty preposterous stories about Ted Cruz's father being involved somehow in the Kennedy assassination. These were pretty much to eliminate or diminish those who were running against Donald Trump.
This is, it's always interesting to, so the media calls this the hush money trial, because there was hush money involved. Alvin Bragg likes to call it the interference trial because, as you point out, he needs to prove that. What does Trump call this? He calls it the Biden trial. It's like, what? It's the Biden trial. Whenever Trump says something, and so when Trump talks about fake news media, he's assuming the entire media operates the way that he has operated with them, which is buying them off, doing favors to print things to hurt opponents and help himself. That's not most of the news media, but it is the news media he's lived in.
Well, let me take a question. And by the way, your questions are welcome here. And this is a big one, particularly since we're talking about the presidential race. And Reed wants to know, does Marc see any hope that the Electoral College might someday be abolished to allow for popular vote presidential elections?
No. And I'll explain very quickly why. It makes sense for all sorts of reasons. But right now, California gets completely cheated. The big states get cheated, and the little states do very well. Wyoming, which has a population somewhere bigger than Fresno and smaller than San Francisco, has 3 electoral votes all to itself. That's not fair. But in order to amend the Constitution, you got to get 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states to approve it. They couldn't even do that to give women equal rights under the Constitution in the 70s with the ERA. There's one change that it makes so much sense to me, but the Democrats aren't going to like this, which would be to, instead of having it be state by state, give every congressional district an electoral vote. That's what they do in Maine. That's what they do in Nebraska. And what that would mean is, now here's why Democrats won't like it, because in California, instead of Biden getting all the electoral votes, Trump would pick up 6 electoral votes from the few Republican parts of California. It also means Democrats would pick up some electoral votes in Texas. It would mean that the entire country would be able to see these candidates. But because it advantages some people now, and the threshold is so high to amend the Constitution, don't see it happening.
Well, I think Biden had a victory in the last election, if you have to, I suppose, exclude those who feel it was stolen, but most of us who see it as having been a well-run and decent, honest election. What to put him over the top was the African-American vote and Jim Clyburn bringing a lot of particularly blacks in the South in behind him. Is that going to translate into this next election?
This is one of the things that's going to be on the cusp. I don't think that, and there are states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania again, and Georgia, where the African-American vote will be the difference. And if Biden picks up 90%, as Democrats do, he'll do fine. But the problem is, there absolutely are polls that show that young, black men in particular, now most of them are still voting Democratic, but many of them, as many as 20-25%, are going to the Republican side. Now, young black men don't tend to vote in large numbers, and that's a factor. But look, if African Americans didn't vote, Bob Dole would have been president. It's like the African American vote has kept this country on, sort of on. And when you say it's not like we're picking some random race here, remember, African Americans couldn't vote for the first half of this country. And, only recently have they been guaranteed equal rights. And the same with women. And if women didn't vote, Bob Dole also would have been president.
You still put a lot of faith in the polls, Marc.
Michael, they work. Of course, they're flawed a lot, but I think the proof is in how much money candidates put into them. They're not going to spend money on something that fails them over and over and over again. And the problem is this. The problem is you have to figure out who's going to show up at the polls. And that's really tough. So you ask people, are you going to vote? And they all say, of course I'm going to vote. And we know that they're lying about that. So they come up with increasingly sophisticated ways. They ask, do you know where your voting precinct is? Or if you really want to spend money, you go down to City Hall and you look at only people who have voted in, say, 4 of the last 5 elections. And then you only poll those people. But those polls tend to be pretty accurate.
We're talking, if you just joined us, to Marc Sandalow, and we do welcome any questions or comments you may have about the presidential election. I'm going to do a little pivot here, though, for the moment, because you've stirred up a good deal of controversy talking about immigration and seeing it pretty much as a myth in many respects, at least the way it's been framed and the way it's been politicized, and the way immigrants, especially, I suppose what we could call appropriately undocumented, some will call illegal, come into this country and then seem to, in many people's minds, become criminals or worse than that, murderers, rapists, and so forth. I mean, right. Donald Trump has helped to frame things this way to a great degree. Why is this a myth, or why is this illusory?
Just look at the statistics. It is true, as Donald Trump says, that we have more people crossing the southern border than ever before. Okay, so that's a fact. Fine, more immigrants are coming in. How does he explain that the crime rates have gone down then? It doesn't make any logical sense. And what he says, And this is what he says. He says, you won't hear this from the press. The press will never tell you this, but the murder rate's the highest it's been in 45 years. Well, there's a reason the press doesn't tell you that, because it's not true. The murder rate is about as low as it's been in 45 years. And crime rates are down. They're not down in Washington, D.C., sadly, but even in San Francisco, which Ron DeSantis came and filmed the commercial out there, and Trump has claimed as a failed city because of its rising crime rate, violent crime is down. And this is with an influx of immigrants. And what amazes me is how even in places like New Hampshire and Iowa, where they began the Republican process of selecting the nominee, these people said that immigration was their number one concern. There aren't a whole lot of immigrants there. I mean, of course, there are some, but not a lot. And I'll tell you why I get fired up about this, and it really bothers me greatly. Teaching at the University of California, it's an incredibly diverse group. And you are filled with first generation, either immigrants or college students or the sons and daughters of these immigrants. These are the American dream. These are people who are succeeding in ways that the previous generation couldn't have dreamed of. And their life is much more difficult now because you have people on a national stage claiming that people who look like them are murderers and rapists and thugs. And some of them are. But, there are nuns who are murderers. There's rabbis who have killed people. There are journalists who have done evil things. So, of course, you can always find that.
Well, the stories that stand out, though, I mean, you think of the young Steinle in San Francisco who was killed by an illegal immigrant. And it was killed because he was not murdering her. I mean, he was firing a gun and was haphazard and so forth. But there are these stories that stand out. A young woman in Georgia, for example, comes to mind, and there's a cop a Venezuelan illegal or undocumented immigrant, punched, and so these stories are sensationalized. There is a problem that begins with the media in some of that, but then you have Trump talking about MS-13 people coming into the country, and that seems to resonate with people. They think, oh, these gang members, they're the ones who are causing so much problem.
And there just isn't, I mean, he talks about them bringing drugs in too. And it's true. Fentanyl coming over the Mexican border is killing tens of thousands of Americans. It's terrible. But undocumented immigrants don't bring the drugs in. It would be insane for them to, just like it would be insane for undocumented immigrants, as Trump asserts, to vote illegally in elections. Why would you risk your immigration status to cast one ballot illegally? It's insane. Fentanyl is smuggled over the Mexican border mostly by American citizens at ports of entry. And sure, we should do things to stop it, but we don't want to blame, just because they look darker than other people, Mexicans or, the offspring of Mexicans. And I'll tell you, I have struggled with this because I've done journalism a long time and I've done teaching. You try to stay as objective as possible. And I really try to stay objective with conservative policies or liberal policies. It's when you start throwing that hatred in there that it's really hard to stay even-keeled because it's very inappropriate and it's very destructive.
Is it possible, though, given the state of the world now, that there could be also terrorists coming through? I mean, we don't necessarily have, let's say, the kind of exhaustive and inclusive, we just don't have the resources, really.
Sure. No, there's no question that terrorists could be coming in. But it's remarkable to me that we haven't had a terrorist attack really since September 11th. They're not in a huge.
My mother would say, "Bite your tongue or touch the wood when you."
Yes, and I have his fake wood here to knock on, but of course, there are all sorts of things. If you look at the number of jihadist killings, which Trump talks about in the United States, this is true statistic because I've looked this up. Of course, there have been jihadist killings. That guy down in Orlando who shot up that nightclub. There have been all sorts of things where people yell out Allah Akbar and have killed people. That is true. But more Americans are killed every year by cows than are by people who claim to be jihadists. They're farmers. About 20 farmers a year get kicked into holes or stepped on by cows. That doesn't mean we have a crisis in cow killings. It means we have a problem with this. But we have also, that's not where the murder problem is in the United States. It's not with jihadists. It's with inner city crime and handguns.
I hadn't even thought about the bovine problem that we may face here until you brought it up. What about the attempted impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas? Immigration head, Republicans went after his head, so to speak, wanted it on a platter, and clearly did not succeed. But
I mean, it's totally appropriate for them to complain about his immigration policies if they oppose them. I mean, nothing wrong with that. That's not a high crime and misdemeanor, which is the bar for, for impeachment, which is why, there have been people who've complained about secretaries of cabinet. I mean, think of what the Democrats thought about Donald Rumsfeld. He ran the war in Iraq, but that's different from impeaching. To me, they knew this would never succeed. He'd never be convicted of this. What they want to do is make impeachment sound normal. It's like they can say, well, look, Donald Trump was impeached twice. Yeah, well, look, even Biden's the Homeland Security guy was impeached. Everyone's impeached. I think that's really what this was about.
So when we hear these denunciations of big cities from the Trump administration and from others as well, the cities, too many homeless, too many problems, car windows being broken promiscuously and for sometimes no reason, but high robbery rates and so forth, robberies taking place, huge numbers almost of masses committing robberies and so forth. It's easy to scapegoat and demonize immigrants. I mean, but yet those problems are real, aren't they?
No, the problems are real. It's hard for people to understand this because of the way that the media and mostly Republicans have talked about it. The problem is real. The problem is less severe than it was a few years ago. Crime is going down. But let me give you a good example of how fake this stuff is. There's a guy who still has a show, Dan Bongino. It was on Fox, and now he's on some radio thing. He once had a conservative guy. He once had a poll that came out, and he put a graphic up, the 10 most unhealthy cities in America. And San Francisco was number one. Then Seattle, Boston. He's like, look at all these lefty cities. This proves to you that Democrat mayors don't care whether you die. You go to one of those cities. He went on and on. Well, after the show was over, as pointed out, he read it a bit wrong. It was the healthiest cities, not the most unhealthy, the healthiest. So he goes on a show the next time it went on, and he blamed his staff, said, oh, my staff got the graphic wrong, so it turns out I was wrong about that. But that doesn't stop my main point, which is that these are deadly cities. It's like, what are you talking about? If you're using a study to prove your point, and the study says the opposite, the problem here is that there's no honesty in this. People have reached conclusions. The fact that big cities are dangerous plays well into certain people's politics. That doesn't mean that big cities are safe, but we shouldn't assume that just because, Democrats run big cities, they don't know what they're doing.
When you say a city is healthy, is that the same as saying a city is safe?
No, that's now again, this is a wallet hub, which is not necessarily the arbiters of who is healthiest. No, it had things like the number of vegan restaurants in town. You can see what San Francisco did pretty well. Green space that's available. The cities at the bottom of the list were, a bunch of southern cities where, fast food is more common than veggie.
Yeah, that's more healthy.
Burgers.
More of an issue of health.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But no, it's not the same as safe. San Francisco is also not one of the more dangerous cities in the country. There are parts of San Francisco which are horrific. I know you spent many years in the Bay Area. Parts of it are, horrific problems. But again, going there to film a television commercial, which is what Ron DeSantis did, to say that the city needs to do something to stop this, his solution is to kick them out. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Oakland. They're going to come up to, they're not going to go to Marin County because they won't let them up there. But kicking them out doesn't solve the problem. Giving them shelter, that might solve the problem, but that costs money and they don't want to do that either.
We have 3 times the number of undocumented immigrants in San Francisco than just about any other national big
I
city.
think the stat that always amazed me is 1/3 of San Franciscans, more than that, were not born in this country. Now, many of them are legal citizens, but 1 out of 3 San Franciscans is an immigrant.
What's a sanctuary city?
We're a sanctuary city, and, without being too crass about it, it's one of the reasons the food is so good there.
Well, let's get back to the presidential campaign in this. I mean, the border is bound to be a major issue for many people, if
right.
not, and so is apparently abortion. And the kind of divide between Republicans and Democrats are along those 2 lines, aren't they?
Well, and for many people, it's the same. There are many people who are anti-immigrant who are pro-abortion rights, and be interesting to see how they come down. I mean, I think with abortion, there's some places like Florida and Arizona now where it's going to be on the ballot. And for years, Karl Rove as George W. Bush's guy was always trying to get abortion measures or same-sex marriage measures onto state ballots because he knew it would drive the conservative vote out there. Even if they didn't care about the presidential election, they would vote because they care about those issues. That is flipped. Right now, the people who care most about abortion are people who tend to be young, Democratic women, and they're more likely to end up voting for Biden if they're at the polls. So, yeah, that's why Biden's been talking abortion, nonstop for this last week. Kamala Harris has been talking about abortion a lot. This is one issue where the Democrats align with public opinion quite squarely, unlike immigration.
Well, there was supposed to be a conservative wave in the midterms, and I think abortion turned it in ways that had been unexpected, even in places like Kansas. I mean, it was certainly clear. But the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of people who are still kind of one-issue people, aren't there?
Yes, and that always tended to be, they were overwhelmingly fundamental Christians who would show out. And look, there's some intellectual honesty to it. I knew some people who would say, I'm voting for Trump because I'm a Christian. And you say to them, what are you talking about? It's like Trump is the least Christian behaving candidate we've ever had.
Hey, come on. He puts a Bible up for sale. It has the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
And you get bonuses in it, right? But their point was, I'm a fundamental Christian. He's going to appoint people to the Supreme Court. He is going to push for policies that are going to be more consistent with my Christian belief. And there still are a lot of people who feel that way.
He has put 3 people on the Supreme Court, and I think suspects maybe they should be more transactionally behind him on different things because that's the way he's always operated. But now we're suddenly getting the message, at least, that maybe they're more open to the idea of some kind of immunity, that the justices are.
Well, I think the real danger with what happened in the Supreme Court, just this week is that it's unlikely the court is going to give him immunity. And by the way, he wasn't asking really for he was asking for total. No one suggests he can strangle Melania in the White House and say, hey, I'm president, I get away with it. He's saying that anything that has any official act involved. So, the justices were saying, so fine. So he accepts a bribe to appoint someone as an ambassador. That you're saying that's an official act, so it's not prosecutable. And it went back and forth. Here's what the most likely outcome of this, and it's really bad it's a victory for Trump. They very likely are not going to give him full immunity. They're going to make up some rules about immunity and send him back to the lower court. That's going to be a 6-month delay. What that means is if Donald Trump wins the election, this prosecution will never happen because the trial couldn't possibly start until the end of this year, early next year. And once if he wins, is in charge of the Justice Department, there's no question he orders the Justice Department to stop its prosecution. And you think about 4 years it's taken to get this. What kind of a justice system do we have then that you cannot prosecute a president for alleged crimes when he was in office in time so that voters would know about it 4 years later?
Well, you're going to see a very different Justice Department if Donald Trump is reelected as president. I think that's safe to say with certainty. Here's Jill from Cleveland, Ohio. And Jill, thank you for this question. She wants to know, how do you see the future of bipartisanship in American politics?
I keep thinking that there will be, bipartisanship will prosper when it is politically popular. And like right now, I spent many years, and I still have big connections to San Francisco. People in San Francisco say, we want compromise. If Nancy Pelosi came back to San Francisco saying, hey, Ted Cruz and I just made a deal. You might not like it, but we compromised. They'd throw her out of office. Maybe not, but they'd hate her for this. And I mean, what's going to be popular is when people who toe the center line, when the Joe Manchins of the world or those sorts of people, the Dianne Feinsteins, the late Feinsteins of the world, who used to bring people together, if that ever gets popular, other people are going to emulate it. I mean, people emulate what wins in elections. And right now, the system is not set up very well to do that because of gerrymandering and a number of other reasons. Congress is much more polarized than the rest of the nation is.
Well, you have a Freedom Caucus on the one hand, and you have AOC and company on the other hand. I mean, there's a right flank and a left flank on both parties, but it seems that the Freedom Caucus, led by now maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene, I mean, she seems to be in a position of some quasi-leadership, talking about, not wanting government to run because they don't want to work with Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. And every day that goes on, and I am perhaps biased in that, I wrote a book about Nancy Pelosi. She looks better every day that goes on, just in terms of her leadership skills. Forget her politics at all. Nancy Pelosi had a wider range of views in her Democratic Party than Mike Johnson or Kevin McCarthy had in the Republican Party. I mean, she had everything from, the Heath Schulers, the conservative North Carolina Democrats who she had to have win to become speaker. And then she had Barbara Lee from across the bay in Oakland and Maxine Waters. She had something that neither McCarthy or Johnson have. She had credibility with the left. So she could do things more down the middle pragmatically and go to that left wing of her caucus, Freedom Party equivalent on the Republican side, and say, my heart is with you. I'm a lefty just like you are. Trust me, this is the best we can get. And they trusted her. That began to fade as people like AOC got elected. The squad was not so fond of Nancy Pelosi, but she found a way to keep them in check, and she kept that caucus together in a way that nobody has shown any signs of being able to do on the other side of the aisle.
Well, Pelosi and Biden, and maybe you could put a few Republicans in this, Romney or possibly Lynn Cheney. Well, maybe not Lynn Cheney. I mean, certainly anti-Trump Lynn Cheney. But, I mean, legislation was always very difficult to make, and you needed bipartisanship. And it was something that was looked at as part of the civic process. It was given a good deal of approbation at one point. I mean, certainly Biden was a great believer in it, and to an extent.
Yeah, but let me just complicate this for a minute. I mean, you're right about that, but it's also true that in the good old days of bipartisanship, you also had a much less demographically diverse Congress, right? Congress didn't represent everybody. It is right now, it's about 2/3 white men in Congress, even though white men are about 1/3 of the country. Back then, in what people refer to as the good old days, I'm not talking 50 years ago, I'm talking 20, 30 years ago. White men were 80 to 90% of the Congress. And it seemed much easier for these people to make compromises with each other because they didn't have as big a constituency to be responsive to. And that's one of the problems with, it's one of the great things about diversity. It's also one of the problems. It slows things down. I don't know how this is going to end at this point. But the most likely way for those who want to be optimistic is that people will start rewarding less bombastic politicians, which I'm not terribly optimistic with. And again, this gets through a conversation in the media, which certainly rewards looniness.
Well, I share your lack of optimism, particularly because of the fact that you can get a lot of social media attention, which means a lot of money, if you simply are anti-government or sound almost quasi-anarchistic. It seems to be almost axiomatic. But let me go to some more questions here. Sam from Miami says, how do you think the role of journalism has evolved in this era of digital media and social platforms?
Terribly. It's a real problem. Journalism, and it's better than, journalism in this country is a capitalist enterprise. People do it to make money or at least stay in business. I like to say that I worked for a nonprofit for 21 years, the San Francisco Chronicle, but they were trying to make money. They just failed at it because they weren't doing very well, so they lost money. But unlike China or unlike Russia, where the media are arms of the state, here they are rewarded for selling commercials, selling advertisements, getting clicks, and that means they appeal to the masses. And it's a real problem. There's a fascinating book out there by the former political editor at Fox News. He was fired after he called Arizona for Biden in the last election, and the White House phoned and said, no, that doesn't help us. Take that away. He said, what are you talking about? We got polls here. I'm a journalist. He got fired by Fox News. Chris Steyerwalt is his name. He writes that Fox News, I think it's very perceptive. He worked there for 10 years as political editor. He says it is not an arm of the Republican Party. What it is a capitalistic television station that wants to appeal to Republican voters. They will put whatever they think their audience wants to hear on the air. That way they sell more commercials. That's not journalism. That's entertainment. And, I think the same could be said about MSNBC. There were, people, you never hear Rachel Maddow have a serious discussion of Joe Biden's age. That's not what her audience wants to hear.
We had a podcast with Jeff Jarvis, so we went into some of the nuances that you're alluding to here, and just wanted to give that a plug for those who follow this podcast. Dan is with us from Bakersfield, and he wants to know, could you compare the congressional dynamics during a major legislative process you covered in the past with a recent one.
Yeah, well, so I'll date myself here. I mean, this was, when I first arrived in Washington decades ago, the first big piece of legislation I covered was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And there you saw, it was bipartisan, but it also, you had people like Nancy Pelosi, obviously on the left, supporting NAFTA because trade was very important for San Francisco. You had other liberals saying this is a complete disaster to lead to exploited workers. Same with conservatives. They were up and down. There's no question things are more polarized than they used to be. And I admit I do not see legislation. I mean, I'm not in them. I mean, I used to cover this stuff and talk to people behind the scenes more. But in the past, you would talk about how many votes you could get on the other side. You don't hear that now. It's, can we keep our entire party together so that we can pass something like this? And, what it shows you is that Congress is completely divided.
There's always this argument that maybe it's so divided and so polarized because congressional representatives don't stay in Washington. They go home and they don't necessarily feel connected to each other. They don't go for lunch as much as they used to because they're not there.
That may be true. But I mean, again, flipping that around, what it also means is that members of Congress are spending more time with their constituents. And, that should advise, what they do. And, when they did used to stay here more often, again, this was not that's part of the whole good old days, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would have a drink at the end of the day. And yeah, you can't picture Marjorie Taylor Greene and Joe Biden hanging out doing anything together. But that's partly just because of the diversity of the Congress. But let me just go back to the media for a moment. When you're putting together, and Michael, I praise you, you've always done this. When you used to do radio, and on this, you do not look for the kind of confrontational, debates that cable television, a lot of radio thrive on. I put up for my students a picture of AOC and Maxine Waters and all. They immediately know Marjorie Taylor Greene. They identify them just like that. No problem. They've seen them on TV. They know who they are. I put up these other two middle-aged white guys up there and say, who are they? They have no idea. They were the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the Republican, and the ranking Democrat. Those two are arguably the most important members of Congress. It's where all tax bills originate. But no one has any idea who they are, because if you yell and scream and you're good at it, you get yourself on television, you have social media followers. It's not a great way to inform the public.
You've certainly hit on a very central point, I think, that we all have to despair of and be keenly aware of. But the fact also of the matter is that the educated class isn't as educated as it used to be and isn't as informed as it used to be, because everything is so fragmentary and media is not necessarily providing us with what we need beyond some of the clickbait you alluded to. So the reality is depth and understanding. I mean, it's appalling. I was a professor for many years. I used to be astonished by young people not knowing different branches of government, not knowing, essentially what are the tools of civics, the elemental tools of civics. But before I get on my high horse here and sound homiletic, let me go to another one of our listeners. This is Heather in Plano, Texas, who wants to know your thoughts, Marc, on the balance between national security and privacy in government policy. Big question, too. Thank you, Heather.
And again, as much as I've been ranting here, I try not to, I try to be the journalist here and try to, sort of try to explain this as objectively as I can. The one thing that surprises me is a complete flip on this. Remember during, it's 9/11, and after 9/11, George Bush started cranking up what the NSA could do, and Democrats were the ones who were outraged. Republicans said, look, in the name of national security, we got to do this. And Democrats said, who you're going to be targeting. It's people with Arab last names. This is an intrusion on privacy. Now they just reauthorize this FISA bill, which allows intelligence agencies to collect information like this. And it was mostly Republicans who were opposed to it, partly because Donald Trump said they should be opposed to it because he says he's getting spied on. But you had Democrats standing up for things in a way that they never have done before. So there's, a big flip. I mean, I was in Washington for September 11th. That's 2 decades, quarter century ago almost. Right after that, there was almost no appetite for limiting security and, personal liberties, to hell with them. It just wasn't. And now I think we've gone back to a place where I think intrusion's a big deal. But again, let me just go to the new generation. When I talk to students about this, they assume everything about them is on the internet anyways. And I say, yeah, but do you realize that, they can track where you're going? I mean, we're not talking about the government. I'm talking about the Disney Channel. They can track where you take your phone. And they're like, yeah, they don't care.
Brings up TikTok. Where do you stand?
Best description was my son, who's now in his mid-20s, who told me he said the problem with it, he goes, I'll spend a half an hour on TikTok. And I feel like I've completely wasted 30 minutes. I've done absolutely nothing. And now I want to spend the next 30 minutes doing the same thing. And yeah, that's, I can understand why it's addictive. My students, again, I don't want to keep, it's not a random sample. They are outraged by the ban on TikTok. They like TikTok. And I mean, to the extent that the Chinese government can get information from people, that's a problem. I've also been assured by people who I trust on this, I don't know the answer, that there is zero way for the Chinese government to actually get their hand on any of the information coming from TikTok from the US, because it goes through servers in other countries that they don't have any rights to get their hands on. So yeah, social media is a real problem, but it's a real slippery slope once you start banning these things. People say, they got to kick Trump off these things. But then, I mean, do you really trust a group of probably young men in a boardroom in San Francisco making decisions about what the public should and shouldn't see? That's also quite scary to me.
It's frightening, in fact, harrowing to think. Chinese have access to a lot of data, though, because of TikTok. They own TikTok.
So I just spoke with, I'm still in Washington. I just spoke with a lobbyist. Now, admittedly, she was lobbying for TikTok. But she's no reason to try to con me. This is just a private conversation. She insists that, yes, it is true that you can collect a lot of information on social media. And it's true that Chinese companies can be ordered by the government to turn over information. She says all the information on TikTok goes through a server in the United States that there's no way the Chinese government have access to. I don't know whether or not that's true or not. And already this is more involved than most of the news stories are going to read about TikTok.
Little sirens are going off of skepticism in my mind to that explanation, but
yeah,
I'll have to look into it a little bit more. No. Colleen has a question. She wants to know, what do you think about ranked choice voting?
It's confusing. I like the idea in some ways, but I have to say it makes my head spin in terms of how you game it out. I mean, here's the thing. Let's say that we had an election right now where you got to vote for Nikki Haley, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden, and it was rank order. Nikki Haley would be president. I have no doubt about that at all, because no one who likes Biden is going to put Trump number 2, and no one who likes Trump is going to put Biden number 2. So Nikki Haley would be, some people would have number 1, and everybody would have as number 2, and that could win her the election. I mean, I don't say this to endorse Nikki Haley. That might not be the worst thing in terms of getting moderate voters out there. I just haven't looked. I think it confuses more people than it does at this point. And I like the idea of it getting more candidates involved, more third-party candidates involved, and maybe it would stop some of the extremism. One other idea to stop such extreme, by the way, would be mandatory voting. They do this in Australia. And when you think about the reason that would make people more moderate, like right now, it's not only 40% are Democrat, 40% are Republican, and 20% are in the middle, so you have to go for the middle vote. Karl Rove figured out 25 years ago, to hell with the middle. Let's just fire up our base. If everyone votes from our base, we're not going to win by much. In fact, he lost the popular vote, but won by just enough to be president. And that's been the push in American politics. If everyone had to vote, you wouldn't have to worry about your base. Your base is going to show up. If everyone had to vote, maybe you could have more moderate candidates. And political scientists have written, since this will never happen, one way to encourage it, more voting like this, to have the same effect, have a lottery. Everyone who votes gets a ticket. Then we give out $10 million to somebody every election day, so that, they're pointing out that would get everyone from both bases out to vote. Then you'd have candidates aimed at the middle rather than the extremes.
We're always looking for more ways to fructify or to make democracy last and sustainable. Ranked choice voting is one of them, I think. Maybe even mandatory voting could be pinpoint it as another. But my question for you is, how much is democracy going to weigh in this election that's coming up? I mean, Joe Biden certainly tried to make it a centerpiece.
I mean, I think it's a big concern, but this is where I have to say, after the 2016 election, I'm much more aware of this than I used to be. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, which they claim is the most educated city in America because we have all these NIH doctors, not because they're journalists there. And I go to work in Washington, D.C. I talk to people in San Francisco. I talk to college students from the University of California. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My bubble is pretty narrow. And as a result, I think that I hear lots of people concerned about democracy, but they're all liberal Democrats who are scared of Donald Trump. And the only thing I try to caution them about is, Donald Trump, if there were no Donald Trump, there would still be many of these attitudes in America. Maybe fewer people would think that Mexican immigrants are rapists and murderers because these are words he used. But it's not as if Donald Trump stirred all this up. He rode this wave to election. And that can be very, very troubling for some of us who don't like what he has to say about groups of people. But as a result, I don't know. And this sounds so cliche. The only reason I'm not as pessimistic as I probably sound here is because of these young people I teach. These people, again, you get enthused with the way they accept diversity, the way they help each other out, the way that they are idealistic about working, for the public good in the future. And you see that, and it's like wonderful. But now I sound like somebody's grandfather saying, oh, the kids are going to be all right.
Let me go to another question for you from Frank in Denver. He says, is the real danger, we're back to TikTok, a massive loss of productivity in the United States?
There's no question that many people I know have lost productivity to TikTok. Yes, although the fact is that the same brilliance that leads to social media and the advent of TikTok leads to, AI and other things that mean that there may be less labor required. So I don't think the productivity has been, as big a problem. Car accidents are up. And, I have a problem in my classes because students half the time are looking at their computers. And as I tell them, if you're fact checking me, go right ahead. That's wonderful. They're not fact checking me. They're on Facebook or on TikTok because they can't get away from it for an entirety of a class. Yeah, that's a problem.
I think another problem is the reels and what they represent. They are sometimes, shall we say, troubling in terms of even. I'm not trying to sound like a prude here because I'm not, but sometimes what we might consider appropriate morality for young people, or at least guidelines and paradigms for young people, things along those lines. But let me go to another political question. This is from Chad, who says, what needs to happen for third-party candidates to be taken seriously?
I thought we were much closer to that now because there's such disdain for the two presidential candidates. Overwhelming majority say they'd much rather there was somebody else running. The problem is both sides are so scared of the other one that, a third-party candidate, I think people understand they're throwing their vote away. Ralph Nader used to come to the place, to talk to students all the time. And, Ralph Nader is somebody who arguably, led to the war in Iraq, if you want to look at it that way. Because if Al Gore had won, if Nader hadn't run, Gore was president, we probably wouldn't have gone to war in Iraq. History would be very different. He would sharply disagree with that.
He would vociferously disagree because it came up in an interview I did with him.
He gets a little haughty about that, doesn't he?
Some people see him as arrogant and narcissistic. I happen to like Ralph Nader, but there was certainly a kind of obduracy with him that he just didn't want to in any way concede that he had harmed the democratic process. In fact, he saw himself, I think I can say safely, as someone who really gave greater credence to the democratic process operating.
The problem is it's hard to see right now. I mean, George Wallace got some electoral votes as a third-party candidate, but no one else has really come close. And
well, Perot changed an election, didn't he?
It's arguable, but it's certainly possible he took more votes, enough votes away from Bush. He certainly didn't win any states, but yeah, and he certainly he probably helped Bill Clinton become president.
I think he did, yeah.
it's a good question about third parties, and it's hard to. I mean, the appetite is really ripe right now. The problem is, it's like a catch-22. It's ripe because people are so sickened by the candidates, but now people are so sickened by the candidates, they're scared to death of not staying true to their own party.
It's like we have a dearth of leadership on the one hand, but as far as being true to one's own party, the Republican Party has really become Trump's party. I mean, he sees things from his sort of tunnel vision, I suppose, and he thinks the Democratic Party is run by Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is the sort of dictator maybe Donald Trump would like to be, but that's not the case.
So all right, so think about it. I mean, and again, this is fantasy, but you think about somebody with the oratorical skills of Barack Obama and the working class cred of Joe Biden maybe 20 years ago when he was more of a lunch pail guy, and the instincts of whether or not, of calling out political BS, even if he is full of it more than anybody else, of Donald Trump, and, sort of moderate politics of, Joe Manchin and if you put all that together in the right candidate, a third party candidate could really change American politics. It's just right now we don't seem to have anybody like that anybody that talented is trying to get themselves elected through one of the, I don't know who that person would be, but they're going through the regular party channels right now.
Well, but the regular parties have too much power, and they have hegemony because they have a lot of money and they have all the structure and infrastructure and so forth. I mean, it makes a world of difference. I've got a question from Tanya in Texas. I like that alliterative sound. Texas Tanya joining us with a question. Thank you for this, Tanya. She says, what should be done for the 7 million small U.S. businesses on TikTok?
So this is, again, not my expertise. It seems to me it's not that hard for them to switch over to to whatever the other social media. Something will come take TikTok's place, and Instagram. There are already lots of things there. Now, this is said from somebody who doesn't use this stuff. So easy for me to say that. I understand that's probably a very serious problem, having to shift everything all the way over. It's amazing, though, that this is one of the bipartisan bills that has now passed Congress. Is one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is to ban TikTok, which is, I guess, passed in the House and the Senate, and is probably headed to the White House for its approval coming weeks.
Yeah, I was talking about Trump's control of the Republican Party. It's fascinating to me that when there was actual legislation that was in the hopper and moving forward as far as the borders and as far as curbing, putting a lot more money into security and into guards and so forth, Trump said, I don't want that to pass. And the Republicans pretty much fell in line. I mean, this is what they were demanding. This is what Mike Johnson was demanding, more money for control of migrants coming in the country.
And then when you see people like Mitch McConnell or Bill Barr, the former attorney general, who, say that they are disgusted by Donald Trump, that he is, yet they're going to vote for him. It once again... it once again brings up this view in people that this is, I grew up in Ann Arbor, so I enjoyed the Michigan and Michigan National Championship. For those of you who are Michigan fans out there, I'm sorry for those of you who are not Michigan fans. If somebody tells me something objectively nice about Ohio State, no, they're wrong. And I can play this in sports. And actually, I did go on to X for a while during the national championship run. And it turns out Michigan's fantastic. Everything I was getting, every feed I was getting, it turns out that the other side were bad and they were cheaters. I loved it. This was fantastic. But that's okay for sports. For sports, you can be non-objective. You can be unreasonable. Politics is, government is serious business, and you shouldn't be doing that.
Little did I know we'd conclude here talking about Go Blue and all that. I mean, I have brother and father and sister who all graduated from Ohio State, but we won't even go there.
I did not know that, Michael, and okay.
Let me actually first say thanks to all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday generally, but also here on Apple, Spotify, and our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show. And that's Gray with an E. You can find previous episodes. And let me just mention a few. We've had great political analysts like Marc Sandalow. We did a Well, if you consider Geraldo Rivera, for example, a great political analyst, we did a podcast with him, and we did one with Sean Walsh and Bruce Kane and Jim Fellows and Ron Elving, just to list some of the folks that have graced our podcast. I also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me directly at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And want to thank the Great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to this week's special guest, Marc Sandalow. And you want to know anything about baseball, those of us who love baseball and are interested in baseball, want to give him a plug on the fine work he's done, letting us know and enlightening us. Also, Marc has a very good book on Nancy Pelosi, which is a well-known book. Thank you, Marc. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.